Hey guys, tonight we're talking about one of humanity's oldest relationships. Not love, not war, not even alcohol. We're talking about cannabis, a plant that appears in written records going back at least 5,000 years, used peacefully across every major civilization, turned into rope that held empires together, medicine that queens relied on, and paper that declarations of independence were written on. And then, in a span of about 30 years in the 20th century, decided it was more dangerous than cocaine. This is the full story of cannabis, and I do mean full. We're starting at the very beginning, in prehistoric Central Asia, where someone made a discovery that would eventually get millions of people arrested. We're going to visit ancient China, where emperors tested plants on themselves like the world's most dedicated guinea pigs. We're going to explore spiritual India, where gods had favourite plants, and nobody thought that was weird. We're going to hang out in medieval Europe, where empires were literally held together by this plant. We're going to meet America's founding fathers, who grew it legally while writing documents about freedom. And then we're going to watch as one racist bureaucrat with a government job convinced the entire world that 5,000 years of peaceful coexistence was actually a catastrophic mistake. The irony will become painful, I promise. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these slow, absurd tales. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket, halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Nobody knows exactly when humans first encountered cannabis. That's the problem with prehistory. Nobody was taking notes. They were too busy trying not to get eaten by things with more teeth than them. But based on archaeological evidence, scientists believe humans have been using cannabis for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer, somewhere in Central Asia. The first written records appear around 5,000 years ago in ancient China, but humans were clearly using it long before anyone thought to document it. Picture this. You're a human in the Neolithic period. You've recently figured out agriculture, which is humanity's way of saying, what if we stopped chasing food and made food come to us instead? Revolutionary stuff. You're experimenting with plants, trying to determine which ones are food, which ones are poison, and which ones make you see your ancestors. It's trial and error, and the error sometimes involves death, so you're pretty motivated to get it right. You encounter this fast-growing plant with distinctive leaves that look like someone asked a botanical artist to design something while slightly tipsy. It grows almost anywhere, thrives on neglect like a cat, and produces seeds, fibre, and a sticky, resinous flower. Not the most promising introduction, honestly. But you're a curious Neolithic human with too much time and not enough entertainment options, so you experiment. You eat the seeds, nutritious, full of protein and healthy fats. You use the stalks for fibre, incredibly strong, perfect for rope and textiles. And at some point, probably by accident involving fire and poor storage decisions, you discover that burning the flowers produces smoke that makes you feel different, relaxed, contemplative, extremely interested in whatever you were about to eat for dinner, and possibly giggly, though humour was probably less developed in 10,000 BCE. Knock-knock jokes had not yet been invented, which was probably for the best. This wasn't a dramatic moment of scientific discovery. There was no Neolithic researcher shouting "Eureka" while running through the village. It was just humans doing what humans do best. Finding plants and immediately asking, can we eat it? Can we use it? And will it make us feel weird? Cannabis scored yes on all 3 counts, making it the overachiever of the plant kingdom. The plant spread along with human migration and trade routes, like a hitchhiker who turned out to be really useful. By 4000 BCE, cannabis was being cultivated in China. By 3000 BCE, it had reached India. By 2000 BCE, it was in the Middle East and Africa. Eventually it would reach Europe and much later the Americas. Humans took cannabis everywhere they went because everywhere they went they found it useful. For most of human history, cannabis wasn't a drug in the way we think of drugs now. It was agriculture, it was medicine, it was technology, it was rope, which doesn't sound exciting until your boat is in the middle of the ocean and you realise rope is the only thing holding it together. Cannabis was as ordinary as wheat or barley or any other crop that made civilization possible. Nobody was having moral panic attacks over rope. Let's start with the oldest written records we have, because if it's written down, historians can argue about it, which is our favourite activity. The year is 2737 BCE, at least according to Chinese legend, which should always be taken with a grain of salt and an appreciation for dramatic storytelling. Emperor Shen Nung, known as the father of Chinese medicine, and the patron saint of seemed like a good idea at the time, is systematically testing hundreds of plants to determine their medicinal properties. His methodology is straightforward and terrifying. Consume plant, observe effects, record findings, try not to die. This is either admirably scientific or monumentally reckless, depending on how you feel about using yourself as a test subject for potentially lethal vegetation. Shen Nung allegedly discovered tea this way, which is delightful. He also allegedly discovered cannabis as medicine, which would later become significantly more controversial despite being equally plant-based. According to Chinese medical texts, Shen Nung documented cannabis, which the Chinese called ma, as treatment for malaria, rheumatism, gout, and what was delicately termed female weakness. Female weakness probably meant menstrual cramps, because ancient medical texts were allergic to saying uterus pain directly. The Chinese medical texts described cannabis as one of the superior elixirs of immortality. Not because it made you immortal, that would be overselling it, but it was considered a superior medicine with multiple beneficial properties and minimal side effects, which in ancient medicine was basically winning the lottery. By 1000 BCE, cannabis was thoroughly integrated into Chinese medicine and agriculture. The Chinese used cannabis fibre, called hemp, for clothing, rope, and paper. Yes, paper. The Chinese invented paper, and some of the earliest paper was made from hemp fibre, while Europeans were still carving things into stone tablets like cavemen with delusions of grandeur. The Chinese were writing on hemp paper about hemp medicine. Efficiency and irony combined. Chinese doctors use cannabis for pain relief, as an anaesthetic for surgery, and even as a treatment for absent-mindedness. That last one is ironic given later stereotypes about cannabis affecting memory, but apparently ancient Chinese doctors thought cannabis helped you remember things. Either they were right and we've misunderstood, or someone was very forgetful about what cannabis does. The Chinese medical establishment looked at cannabis and said, yes, this is good medicine. And they used it that way for over 4,000 years. 4,000 years of continuous medical use without a single governmental freakout, moral panic or international treaty banning it. But that would change when the 20th century arrived with new ideas about what plants were acceptable. If China gave cannabis medical legitimacy, India gave it spiritual significance. And when your God explicitly endorses something, prohibition becomes theologically awkward at best and potentially blasphemous at worst. Cannabis appears in the ancient Vedic texts, some of the oldest religious scriptures in continuous use, which means people have been reading about cannabis in religious context for approximately 3,500 years. The Vedas describe cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants. Not just permitted, not just tolerated, sacred, holy. It was called Vijaya in Sanskrit, meaning victory, which is honestly great branding, and it was associated with the god Shiva, who was one of the principal deities in Hinduism. The legend goes that Shiva sat in the fields and ate cannabis leaves after an argument with his family, because even gods need to cool off sometimes. He found it so delightful that cannabis became his favourite plant. Shiva is often depicted with cannabis, and his followers consume it as a sacrament. This isn't minor religious trivia. This is a major deity in a religion practiced by over 1 billion people. Cannabis wasn't just permitted in Hindu tradition, it was sacred. Trying to prohibit it would be like trying to prohibit communion wine in Christianity. Technically possible, but you're going to upset a lot of people who have theological opinions about it. The most common traditional preparation was bhang, a drink made from cannabis leaves mixed with milk, spices and other ingredients. Bhang was consumed during religious festivals, particularly Holi and Mahashivaratri. It was offered to guests as hospitality, like offering coffee or tea. It was given to newlyweds. It was used in religious ceremonies, meditation, and yoga practice. To refuse bhang in certain contexts was considered rude. No thank you. I don't consume the favourite plant of one of our major gods, was not the polite response. Cannabis was also thoroughly integrated into Ayurvedic medicine, India's traditional medical system that's been around for over 3,000 years. Ayurvedic texts describe cannabis as treatment for anxiety, pain, digestive issues, insomnia, and more. India used cannabis this way for over 3,000 years. 3,000 years of religious tradition, medical practice and cultural integration. Priests used it in ceremonies, doctors prescribed it for patients, families shared it during festivals. This would make India's eventual forced prohibition particularly bitter. While China was writing about cannabis on hemp paper, and India was incorporating it into religious practice, the Middle East and Africa were developing their own relationships with the plant. The Scythians, nomadic warriors from Central Asia, around 700 BCE, had a particularly interesting cannabis tradition that we know about because a Greek historian couldn't resist gossip. Herodotus, the Greek historian often called the father of history and the father of telling everyone else's business, wrote about Scythian funeral rites. According to Herodotus, the Scythians would construct small tents, throw cannabis onto hot stones and hotbox the tent while mourning their dead. Herodotus wrote about it with the tone of someone describing alien behaviour. These barbarians inhale plant smoke and enjoy it. Can you imagine? Yes, Herodotus, we can imagine. Modern archaeology has confirmed Herodotus wasn't making this up. Excavations of Scythian burial mounds have found bronze vessels containing burnt cannabis seeds and residue. The Scythians really were hotboxing their funerals. Whether this was religious, recreational, or therapeutic grief management is unclear. Possibly all three. At least the Scythians were honest about needing help processing death. In the Islamic world, cannabis spread through trade routes during the Golden Age, when Muslim physicians were advancing medicine, while Europe struggled through the Dark Ages. They documented cannabis in medical texts that would later be translated and used by European doctors. Hashish, concentrated cannabis resin, became part of cultural practice across the Middle East and North Africa, treated as normally as Europeans treated wine. In Africa, cannabis use was widespread and ancient. Egyptian medical texts mentioned it for glaucoma and inflammation. In South Africa, indigenous groups used cannabis medicinally and socially for centuries. They called it dagga, and it was part of traditional medicine. Not a crisis, not a problem, just a plant people used. The pattern was consistent. Cannabis was discovered, found useful, integrated into medicine and culture, and then just used, for centuries, without incident, without moral panic, without governments declaring emergencies. Europe's relationship with cannabis was purely practical for over 1,000 years. Europeans had alcohol for intoxication, and were satisfied, thank you very much. But they absolutely loved hemp. to the point where empires literally depended on it. Hemp is cannabis, same plant, just bred for fiber rather than THC. You could smoke hemp all day and accomplish nothing except disappointment. But for rope, textiles, and paper, unmatched. Medieval Europe ran on hemp. Hemp rope held ships together. Hemp sails caught wind. Hemp clothing dressed everyone. The word canvas comes from cannabis because canvas was hemp. Artists were painting on cannabis, and nobody thought this controversial. During the Age of Exploration, every voyage was cannabis-powered. Columbus sailed to America with hemp rigging. The British Royal Navy, which would rule a quarter of Earth, required enormous hemp quantities. One warship could require over 60 tons of hemp. Without cannabis, there was no British Empire. England became so dependent they required colonies to grow it. Without hemp, England was just a rainy island with delusions of grandeur. But Europe also used cannabis medically. By the Victorian era, cannabis tinctures were common in pharmacies. Doctors prescribed them for pain, spasms, nausea, insomnia. This was mainstream, respectable, legal medicine. And here's the kicker. Queen Victoria used cannabis. The British Empire was governed by a queen who took cannabis tincture for menstrual cramps. Her physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds, prescribed it, and later wrote in the Lancet that cannabis was one of the most valuable medicines we possess. The British Empire was held together by hemp rope while the Queen used cannabis medicine, and nobody thought this controversial. It was normal as tea. Cannabis arrived in the Americas relatively late because the Americas were geographically isolated. When European colonizers arrived bringing cannabis, it was initially for industrial use, because Europeans were very practical about plants that made them money. In colonial America, hemp was essential. Virginia passed a law in 1619 requiring every farmer to grow cannabis, not optional, legally mandated. Refusing to grow cannabis was illegal. You could be fined for failing to grow it. In 1619, it was illegal not to grow cannabis in Virginia. Remember this. The irony will become painful. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. We have his diary entries documenting this. Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello. The Declaration of Independence was written on hemp paper. The document that founded America was literally written on cannabis. Hemp was a major American agricultural product throughout the 1700s and 1800s. The government encouraged cultivation. During wars, hemp production was patriotic. The government would later make propaganda films during World War II, encouraging farmers to grow cannabis for America for freedom, then immediately recriminalize it after. Consistency has never been America's strength. But cannabis wasn't just industrial in America, it was medical. Cannabis tinctures were available in pharmacies throughout the 1800s. Eli Lilly, Park Davis, Squibb, major pharmaceutical companies manufactured and sold cannabis medicines openly. The 1851 US Pharmacopeia officially listed cannabis as treatment for numerous conditions. It was legitimate, legal official medicine. You could walk into an 1890 pharmacy and buy cannabis tincture with no prescription, no judgment, no risk of arrest, just normal commerce. Nobody called the police. Nobody worried about society collapsing. It was boring as aspirin. By 1900, cannabis had been integrated into human civilization for 5,000 years, used on every continent. Part of religious traditions, standard medicine in pharmacies worldwide, major industrial crop, thousands of years of continuous use, no international laws against it, no wars on drugs, 0 recorded deaths from overdose. Because you physically cannot overdose on cannabis. This was normal. For 5,000 years, this was humanity's relationship with cannabis. Peaceful coexistence, medical application, industrial necessity, zero drama. But the early 1900s saw changes that would shatter this equilibrium. Industrialization meant synthetic alternatives were emerging. Pharmaceutical companies could patent synthetic drugs, but not plants. Colonial attitudes were intensifying. If non-white people did it, it must be dangerous. The Mexican Revolution began in 1910, and refugees brought marijuana to the US. Americans had used cannabis for decades, but marijuana sounded foreign, Mexican, scary. Same plant, different name, suddenly suspicious. Alcohol prohibition ended in 1933, leaving prohibitionists looking for new targets. Racial tensions intensified. Cannabis laws became tools for social control. Newspapers ran sensational stories about marijuana fiends, none based on evidence, all based on racism. By 1930, the pieces were ready for moral panic. Cannabis was still legal federally, still in pharmacies, but the infrastructure was ready. The racist attitudes were in place. The prohibitionist mindset was looking for a target. All it needed was the right person to orchestrate it, someone who needed a cause, someone who didn't mind lying. His name was Harry Anslinger, and when Prohibition ended, he suddenly had a drug enforcement department with nothing to enforce. The 5,000-year peace was about to end with lies, racism, and fake statistics, delivered with the confidence of a man who knew nobody would fact-check him. Anslinger needed a new enemy, something to fight, something to justify his department's budget, something that would make him look important and keep his job secure, and ideally something that most Americans didn't understand well enough to question him about. He chose cannabis, or rather, he chose to call it marijuana using the Mexican-Spanish term that most Americans didn't recognize, and then convince everyone it was a completely different thing from the cannabis that had been in their medicine cabinets for decades. Same plant, different marketing. Americans had been using cannabis medicine without concern, but marijuana sounded foreign, exotic, dangerous. Brilliant branding for a moral panic. Why cannabis? Well, let's be honest about this, because Anslinger certainly was, at least in private. Cannabis was associated with Mexican immigrants and black Americans, two groups that white America in the 1930s was already deeply racist toward, two groups that had limited political power, two groups that Anslinger could target without much pushback from people who mattered to his career, and Anslinger was exceptionally, explicitly, virulently racist, even by 1930s standards, which is saying something because the 1930s weren't exactly progressive. These aren't interpretations or modern judgments. These are his actual words, documented in official reports and congressional testimony. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men, direct quote. He said that, out loud, in official contexts. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others, also a direct quote. He wasn't hiding his racism, he was using it as policy justification. The quiet part was the loud part. Cannabis wasn't the problem, the people using it were the problem, or rather the people Anslinger wanted to control were the problem, and cannabis gave him legal grounds to arrest them. But Anslinger needed more than just racism to build his case. He needed horror stories. He needed evidence that cannabis was dangerous. The problem was that cannabis wasn't actually dangerous, and there was no real evidence of harm. Centuries of safe use across multiple civilizations don't generate a lot of scary data. So Anslinger made up stories, just invented them. He created what he called his Gore Files, a collection of crimes that he claimed were caused by marijuana use. Murder, assault, insanity, all blamed on this plant. He would wave these files at congressmen, at journalists, at anyone who would listen, presenting them as proof that marijuana turned normal people into violent psychopaths who needed to be stopped before they destroyed America. There was just one small problem with the Gore files. They were lies, complete fabrications. Take Victor Licata. In 1933, this young man in Florida murdered his entire family with an axe. Horrible, tragic, absolutely the kind of crime that generates headlines and public fear. Anslinger loved this story. He cited it constantly, in congressional hearings, in newspaper interviews, in budget meetings with his superiors. This is what marijuana does, he'd say. It makes people violently insane. Give me more funding to fight this menace. Here's what actually happened. Investigators at the time found no evidence that Victor Licata had ever used marijuana. None. Zero. The connection didn't exist. Victor had a documented history of severe mental illness. His family had been trying to get him institutionalized for years. Medical professionals who examined him diagnosed what we'd now recognize as schizophrenia. The marijuana connection, completely fabricated. Anslinger just added it. Because who was going to check this was 1933? There was no internet, no fact-checkers, no way for the average person, or even the average congressman, to verify that the head of a federal bureau was just making things up. And even if someone did investigate and find out the truth, the correction would never get as much attention as the original scary story. Anslinger had dozens of these cases. The Alamosa killer, the LaGuardia werewolf, the Pensacola maniac, real crimes, fake marijuana connections. It's like looking at a car accident caused by someone texting while driving and announcing, "This tragedy was clearly caused by the driver having eaten a sandwich earlier that day. We must ban sandwiches immediately for public safety." Absurd, but effective if nobody questions you. And the lies worked. People don't remember corrections. They remember the first scary thing they heard. You can debunk a lie 10 times, but that initial fear sticks. Anslinger understood this instinctively. He was a natural propagandist, and he had powerful help. William Randolph Hearst owned about 30 newspapers across America. His media empire reached millions of readers daily, and Hearst absolutely hated cannabis, though not for moral reasons, for financial ones. Hearst had invested heavily in the timber industry. His paper mills produced paper from wood pulp, trees that had to be cut down, processed with harsh chemicals, and turned into paper through an expensive, environmentally destructive process. Hemp paper made from cannabis was cheaper, more durable, required less chemical processing, and the plants grew to maturity in months rather than decades. Hemp paper was superior to wood pulp paper and a direct threat to Hearst's timber investments. So when Anslinger launched his anti-marijuana campaign, Hearst's newspapers enthusiastically joined the propaganda effort, not because they cared about public health, because they cared about eliminating economic competition. This wasn't journalism, this was advertising for Prohibition dressed up as news. The Hearst papers ran wild with anti-marijuana stories. "Marijuana makes fiends of boys in 30 days, screamed one headline, with absolutely no evidence to support it. Articles claimed marijuana turns man into a wild beast. Editorials demanded immediate government action. Stories about Mexican marijuana fiends committing crimes. Stories about black reefer addicts in jazz clubs threatening white society. None of this was based on evidence. All of it sold newspapers. One article claimed that marijuana caused unprovoked acts of violence. Another said marijuana users committed most crimes in America. A third warned that marijuana was spreading through schools and corrupting innocent children. The stories got more ridiculous as they went on, but repetition creates its own truth. Say something enough times in enough newspapers, and people start believing it. And then came the piece that would become an unintentional comedy masterpiece, a propaganda film so over the top that it would eventually become the opposite of what it intended. In 1936, a film was produced called Tell Your Children, later renamed Reefer Madness. And oh, this thing is spectacular in its wrongness. The film opens with a very serious man addressing parents about the dangers of marijuana. He presents facts that exist in their own fictional universe. Then we meet clean-cut American teenagers whose lives are about to be destroyed by one marijuana cigarette. Just one. That's all it takes, apparently. According to Reefer Madness, here's what happens when you smoke marijuana. First, you start playing piano, aggressively, with the manic energy of someone who's consumed 17 espressos and received a divine vision. You play faster and faster, laughing maniacally, while everyone around you also laughs maniacally because marijuana apparently comes with a mandatory laugh track. Then you might murder someone, casually. Just, whoops, murder happened, because you smoked a plant. The film shows a hit-and-run death, completely unprovoked, blamed entirely on marijuana. Or you might go permanently insane. One puff and you're institutionalized for life, staring at walls and rocking back and forth, your mind completely destroyed, forever. Because of cannabis, which in reality has never caused permanent insanity in anyone, ever. Or you might become a prostitute. Because marijuana, the film helpfully informs us, immediately destroys all morals, life plans and self-respect. Young women who smoke marijuana inevitably end up selling their bodies. Apparently it's automatic, or you might kill yourself. The film suggests marijuana leads directly to suicide, because when your life has been destroyed by this devil plant, death is the only escape. The film shows marijuana dens where teenagers gather to smoke reefer and immediately descend into chaos, violence, sexual promiscuity, more murder, more insanity, and the complete destruction of several lives, all from marijuana, a plant that, in reality, mostly makes people hungry, sleepy, and interested in listening to music for extended periods. The film was meant to terrify parents into supporting Prohibition, and initially it sort of worked. People who had never encountered cannabis believed this absurd propaganda because why would the government lie? But here's the beautiful irony. By the 1970s, when millions of Americans had actually tried marijuana and realized it didn't make you murder people, Reefer Madness became a comedy. Stoners would watch it in theaters and laugh at how absurdly wrong it was. The propaganda film became a stoner comedy. Perfect. But in the 1930s, people didn't know it was nonsense. They believed it, because the government was saying it. Newspapers were printing it. Authority figures were warning about it. And authority, people assumed, wouldn't just make things up. Spoiler. Authority absolutely would and did. Now let's talk about the racism underneath all this propaganda, because it wasn't subtle and it wasn't hidden. Anslinger's campaign wasn't really about drugs. It was about control. It was about having legal tools to arrest, harass, and deport people that the white establishment wanted to control. In the American Southwest, local laws targeting marijuana were explicitly aimed at Mexican immigrants. Police couldn't make being Mexican illegal, constitutional issues and all that, but they could make something associated with Mexicans illegal, then use that as grounds for arrest and deportation. El Paso, Texas passed an ordinance in 1915, right after the Mexican Revolution sent refugees north. California added cannabis to its Poison Act in 1913. The laws weren't about the plant, they were about the people. Police used marijuana laws as an excuse to raid Mexican neighborhoods, arrest workers and deport families. We found marijuana became legal justification for removing people the authorities wanted gone. The plant was the excuse, Population control was the goal, the same pattern played out with black Americans, particularly jazz musicians. Jazz was considered dangerous music by white conservatives in the 1930s. It was black music. It was played in clubs. It involved improvisation and emotion, and bodies moving in ways that made white people uncomfortable. And many jazz musicians smoked cannabis, which was common in the music scene and completely legal until it suddenly wasn't. Anslinger specifically targeted jazz musicians. Louis Armstrong, one of the greatest musicians America has ever produced, was arrested for marijuana possession. Billie Holiday, another legendary artist, was hounded by narcotics agents for years. Gene Krupa, Mez Mesro, dozens of musicians found themselves arrested, their careers interrupted or destroyed, not because they were harming anyone, but because they were smoking a plant that had been legal their entire lives until suddenly it wasn't, and the enforcement was nakedly racist. White people and black people use cannabis at similar rates, but black Americans were arrested far more frequently. The law was the same on paper, but enforcement was discriminatory by design. It was Jim Crow, but for drugs. A legal tool that appeared neutral, but was applied selectively to control black communities. Anslinger once testified to Congress that jazz musicians were a particular threat, because marijuana gave them superhuman strength and made them think they were equal to white people. That was the threat. Not violence, not crime. The threat was that black people might think they deserved equality, and that apparently had to be stopped. This wasn't just American racism, though America was certainly leading the charge. This pattern of using drug laws to control colonized and minority populations was happening globally. In Jamaica, cannabis, called ganja, was part of working-class culture and would become central to Rastafarian religious practice. The British colonial government criminalised it, not because it was causing problems, but because it was associated with black Jamaicans who the colonial authorities wanted to control. In South Africa, cannabis, called dagga, had been used by indigenous populations for centuries. When apartheid came to power, cannabis laws became another tool to criminalise and control black South Africans. Need to arrest someone but can't find a real crime. Just find some cannabis. Convenient. In India, the British looked at 3,000 years of religious and medical cannabis tradition and decided it was a problem. Not because of evidence. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission had done a comprehensive study in 1894 and concluded cannabis was relatively harmless and prohibition would be impossible to enforce. But evidence didn't matter. Colonial attitudes did. If those people did it, it must be wrong. The pattern was global and consistent. Cannabis laws always, somehow, coincidentally, just happened to target the people already being oppressed. Indigenous peoples, black populations, brown populations, colonized peoples, the poor. What an amazing coincidence. Almost like the laws weren't about the plant at all. But Anslinger still needed to get federal prohibition passed, and that required convincing Congress. And this is where the story gets even more infuriating, because the medical establishment tried to stop him, and Congress ignored them completely. In 1937, Anslinger pushed for the Marijuana Tax Act. This law didn't technically make cannabis illegal. That would have been unconstitutional, but it taxed cannabis transactions so heavily that it was functionally impossible to legally obtain. You could possess marijuana technically, but only if you paid for a tax stamp, and to get a tax stamp, you had to show the marijuana you were taxing. But possessing marijuana without a tax stamp was illegal. It was a perfect catch-22, brilliant bureaucratic manipulation. The American Medical Association opposed this law, strongly, loudly, officially. Dr. William C. Woodward, the AMA's Legislative Counsel, testified before Congress. He pointed out that cannabis had been used medicinally for years with no significant problems. He noted that there was no evidence for the wild claims being made about its dangers. He argued that prohibition would eliminate a useful medicine and accomplish nothing positive except expanding government power. Dr. Woodward told Congress, "The American Medical Association knows of no evidence that marijuana is a dangerous drug. We cannot understand yet, Mr. Chairman, why this bill should have been prepared in secret for 2 years without any intimation, even to the profession, that it was being prepared." He was asking a very reasonable question. Why are you preparing prohibition legislation in secret without consulting doctors? Why are you not asking medical professionals whether this medicine is actually dangerous? Congress didn't care. Congressman Fred Vinson responded, "If you want to advise us on legislation, you ought to come here with some positive proposals rather than criticisms." Translation: "We don't care about your medical expertise, we've already decided. Your facts are inconvenient. Please stop talking." Dr. Woodward tried again. "We are told that this drug produces a violent reaction, that it leads to crime. We have been unable to find evidence of this in the medical literature." Again ignored. The Marijuana Tax Act passed in 1937. So the leading medical association in America, representing doctors who actually treated patients and understood medicine, said this isn't a problem and this law is a bad idea. And Congress said, "Cool story, we're listening to the guy with racist quotes and fake murder stories instead." Science versus propaganda. Propaganda won. It would continue winning for the next 80 years. After the Marijuana Tax Act passed, cannabis was effectively eliminated from American medical practice. By 1942, it was removed from the US Pharmacopeia, the official list of recognized medicines. A plant that had been in American medicine for over a century was suddenly not medicine anymore. Not because new science showed it was dangerous, because politics decided it was inconvenient. Pharmaceutical companies were quietly pleased. Cannabis was hard to patent. It's a plant. Anyone can grow it. But synthetic drugs? Those could be patented. Those could be controlled. Those generated reliable, exclusive profit. Eliminating a plant-based competitor under the guise of public health was just good business. But America wasn't satisfied with just ruining its own drug policy. After World War II, when America emerged as the dominant global superpower with the kind of influence that lets you tell other countries what to do, the US decided to export its cannabis panic worldwide. In 1961, the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs was established. This treaty categorized drugs into different schedules based on their supposed danger and medical value. Cannabis was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, alongside heroin. Schedule 1 means high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision, no currently accepted medical use. This was about a plant that had been used medically for 5,000 years across every major civilization. A plant that was still in use as medicine in many countries. A plant that the AMA had defended just 24 years earlier. No medical use. They just declared it, based primarily on American insistence. The scientific evidence supporting this classification, minimal. The historical evidence contradicting it, overwhelming. But America was the global superpower, and when America said this plant is as dangerous as heroin, other countries said, "Okay, sure, whatever you say." Because disagreeing with America in 1961 was complicated for your foreign policy. Countries that had used cannabis for centuries suddenly found themselves in violation of international law. India, which had 3,000 years of religious and medical cannabis tradition, was pressured into compliance. India's representative at the UN pointed out that cannabis had been used in India for millennia, without the problems America claimed. This argument was noted in the official record and then completely ignored. By the late 1960s, India had effectively criminalised cannabis under international pressure. 3,000 years of tradition tossed out because America had spent 30 years panicking. The same pattern played out worldwide. Morocco, which had been producing hashish for export for centuries, was pressured to eliminate its cannabis industry. Lebanon, Afghanistan, Nepal, all traditional cannabis-producing regions, were told their agricultural traditions were now international crimes. Thailand, where cannabis had been used in traditional medicine and cuisine for centuries, criminalised it under Western pressure. Jamaica was forced to criminalise ganja despite it being part of Rastafarian religious practice. In the Middle East, countries with long hashish traditions adopted harsh penalties. This was colonialism in drug policy form. Western countries, led by America, imposing their recent panic onto cultures with ancient traditions. We've decided this is bad now, despite your millennia of experience suggesting otherwise. You're welcome for the civilization. And then came Richard Nixon, and if Anslinger planted the seeds of the drug war, Nixon turned it into a forest fire that would burn for 50 years. In 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. He launched what would become known as the War on Drugs. Cannabis was a primary target, despite being far less dangerous than alcohol, tobacco, or many legal prescription drugs. Nixon created the Schaefer Commission, officially called the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse. He appointed it himself, stacked it with conservatives he assumed would back his tough-on-drugs position, and asked them to study marijuana and make recommendations. He was clearly expecting them to confirm his prejudices and give him political cover for escalating enforcement. The commission spent 2 years studying the issue. They reviewed all available research. They interviewed experts. They examined cannabis use patterns both in America and abroad. In 1972, they released their report with their official recommendation: decriminalize personal use of marijuana. The report found that marijuana was not as dangerous as claimed, that criminalization was causing more harm than the drug itself, and that penalties should be reduced. Nixon's own commission that he appointed told him he was wrong. Nixon's response? He ignored it completely, didn't implement any recommendations, didn't adjust his policies, didn't even acknowledge the findings publicly. His own commission told him he was wrong based on extensive research, and he just pretended it didn't happen. Why? Well, we got the answer decades later from an inside source, and it's as damning as you'd expect. In 1994, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, gave an interview to journalist Ann Baum, and Ehrlichman said the quiet part out loud in a way that should have ended the drug war immediately. You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That last line. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. They knew. The Nixon administration knew they were lying. They knew marijuana wasn't the threat they claimed. They criminalized it anyway because it gave them a legal tool to target their political enemies. This wasn't drug policy. This was political warfare disguised as drug policy. It was authoritarian population control with a thin veneer of public health concern, and it worked. Throughout the 1970s, marijuana arrests skyrocketed. Young people, disproportionately black and brown young people, were imprisoned for possession, futures destroyed, families separated, criminal records that would follow them for life. all for a plant that Nixon's own commission confirmed wasn't particularly dangerous. The drug war was declared, the lies were official policy, and the catastrophe was just beginning. If Nixon declared war on cannabis, Ronald Reagan decided to carpet bomb it. Reagan took office in 1981 with a smile that could sell anything and a drug policy that would make Anslinger proud. His administration looked at Nixon's drug war and thought, you know what this needs? More. More funding, more enforcement, more prisons, more lives destroyed, more of everything except common sense. Nancy Reagan launched her Just Say No campaign in 1982, which was the government's way of solving complex social issues by telling children to simply not do things. Just say no to drugs. Just say no to peer pressure. Just say no to the systemic racism and economic inequality that actually drive problematic drug use. Simple. Why hadn't anyone thought of this before? Turns out telling teenagers don't do it works about as well as it ever has, which is to say, not at all. But it made for good television and gave the appearance that the government was doing something. But Reagan didn't just rely on catchy slogans. He backed it up with some of the harshest drug penalties America had ever seen. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences. Mandatory minimums are exactly what they sound like. Minimum prison sentences that judges are required to impose regardless of circumstances. Got caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine. 5 years mandatory. Doesn't matter if it's your first offence. Doesn't matter if you're 19 years old. Doesn't matter if you were just holding it for someone else. 5 years. No exceptions. No judicial discretion. The law decided your fate before you even entered the courtroom. And for cannabis, the penalties were absurd. Get caught with 100 marijuana plants. 5 years mandatory minimum. Doesn't matter that marijuana plants vary wildly in size and potency. Doesn't matter that 100 small seedlings are worth far less than 10 mature plants. Count reached 100, 5 years minimum. Simple math, complex consequences. Then came 3 strikes laws. Get convicted of 3 drug felonies and you go to prison for life. Life for drugs. Not murder. Not assault. Not rape. Drugs. People were getting life sentences for marijuana. Multiple offences for possession could add up to life in prison. Steal a car 3 times, maybe 10 years. Grow cannabis 3 times, life. The punishment bore no relationship to the harm caused, because the harm caused was essentially 0. Compare this to actual violent crimes. In many states during the 1980s and 90s, you could beat someone unconscious and get less prison time than you'd get for growing cannabis in your basement. You could rob a convenience store at gunpoint and serve less time than someone caught with a few pounds of marijuana. The sentencing structure revealed what the system actually valued, and it clearly valued punishing drug offenders more than punishing violence. The racial disparities in enforcement were staggering and consistent. Black and white Americans used marijuana at roughly equal rates. Every study confirmed this. But black Americans were arrested for marijuana possession at nearly 4 times the rate of white Americans. In some cities and states, the disparity was even higher. In Montana, black people were 9.6 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people. In Iowa, 8.3 times. In Minnesota, 7.5 times. Same usage rates. Wildly different arrest rates. This wasn't a few racist cops. This was systemic. This was policy. The laws were written in race-neutral language, but enforcement was explicitly discriminatory. Police focused on black neighbourhoods. Courts gave black defendants harsher sentences. Parole boards released black prisoners less frequently. At every stage of the criminal justice system, black people were treated more harshly for the same offence. The war on drugs was a war on black communities with just enough white casualties to maintain plausible deniability. And the consequences weren't just prison time. A drug conviction destroyed your life in ways that extended far beyond your sentence. Got convicted of marijuana possession? Good luck finding a job. Most employers won't hire people with drug convictions. Good luck finding housing. Many landlords won't rent to people with drug records. Good luck getting student loans for education. Federal law prohibited people with drug convictions from receiving financial aid. You lose your right to vote in many states. You lose access to food stamps and welfare benefits. You lose your driver's license in some states, making it impossible to get to work even if you could find a job. A marijuana conviction didn't just mean prison time, it meant permanent second-class citizenship, a lifelong scarlet letter for possessing a plant. And this was by design. The drug war wasn't just about punishment during incarceration. It was about permanent marginalization after release. Make it impossible for people to reintegrate into society, then blame them when they end up back in the system. Perfect circular logic. By the 1990s, America's prison population had exploded. In 1980, there were about 500,000 people incarcerated in America. By 2000, that number had quadrupled to over 2 million. America, with less than 5% of the world's population, held 25% of the world's prisoners. Land of the free, home of the incarcerated. And a huge portion of that increase was drug offences, with marijuana being one of the primary drivers. Between 1965 and 2015, over 20 million Americans were arrested for marijuana-related offences. 20 million people. That's more than the population of Florida, more than the population of New York State. All arrested for a plant that can't kill you, that most of them were using peacefully in their own homes, that was legal in some form in an increasing number of states. 20 million arrests, 20 million lives disrupted, millions imprisoned, millions more with criminal records that would follow them forever. Families separated, children growing up without parents, communities destabilized, futures destroyed, all for cannabis, a plant that had been legal and normal for 5,000 years until one bureaucrat decided it was scary. And America wasn't alone in this madness. The US had successfully exported its drug war globally, and other countries eagerly adopted harsh penalties, often going even further than America had. In Singapore, drug trafficking could result in mandatory death penalty. Mandatory. If you were caught trafficking more than a certain amount of cannabis, 500 grams, just over 1 pound, you were hanged. No judicial discretion, no consideration of circumstances. The law said death, so death it was. Singapore executed people for cannabis. A plant that has never killed anyone through overdose was grounds for government execution. Malaysia had similar laws. Mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking, including cannabis. The Philippines, under various administrations, implemented harsh penalties, and under President Duterte in the 2010s, encouraged extrajudicial killings of drug users and dealers. Thousands were killed by police and vigilantes in what amounted to government-sanctioned murder. Not for heroin, not for methamphetamine exclusively. The drug war killed indiscriminately. Thailand, which had used cannabis in traditional medicine and cuisine for centuries, adopted some of the harshest penalties in Asia. Life imprisonment or death for trafficking. Decades in prison for possession. The same country that had integrated cannabis into their culture was executing people for it. They'd been pressured by international treaties and Western influence to abandon their own history. Saudi Arabia executed people for drug offences, including cannabis. China executed people for drug trafficking. Indonesia executed people for drugs. Iran executed people for drugs. The list goes on. countries around the world decided that the appropriate response to someone possessing or selling a plant was death. Not rehabilitation, not treatment, not education. Death. Even in countries without death penalties, the punishments were severe. In Japan, cannabis possession could get you 5 years in prison. In South Korea, celebrities and athletes had their careers destroyed for marijuana use. In Russia, possession could mean years in prison. In the United Arab Emirates, 4 years minimum for possession, longer for trafficking. France, which likes to think of itself as sophisticated and liberal, had some of the harshest cannabis laws in Europe, up to a year in prison for possession, up to 10 years for trafficking. The global enforcement created a spectrum of absurdity. In the Netherlands, you could walk into a coffee shop and legally purchase cannabis. In Singapore, possession could get you caned and imprisoned. Trafficking could get you executed. Same plant, same year, different country. The difference between a pleasant afternoon and death was geography, and the enforcement wasn't consistent even within harsh countries. Rich people got away with it. Poor people went to prison. White people got warnings. Brown and black people got arrested. Connected people got treatment. Ordinary people got incarcerated. The laws applied in theory to everyone. In practice, they applied to people without power, money, or connections. Meanwhile, the violence associated with the illegal drug trade was escalating. Not because cannabis makes people violent, it doesn't, but because prohibition made it profitable for violent people. When you make something illegal that millions of people want, you don't eliminate demand. You just hand that market to criminals who don't follow regulations and do employ violence. Mexican drug cartels became some of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, not because drugs are inherently profitable, but because prohibition made them artificially profitable. The markup on illegal cannabis was enormous. A product that cost almost nothing to grow. It's a weed. It grows easily. Could be sold for massive profit because of artificial scarcity created by prohibition. Basic economics. Limit supply while demand remains constant and prices skyrocket. The cartels made billions of dollars annually from cannabis sales. Billions. That money funded private armies. It funded corruption of police and government officials. It funded territorial wars between rival organizations. And tens of thousands of people died in Mexico's drug war. Not because cannabis causes violence, but because the illegal cannabis market was worth fighting wars over. The irony is painful. The drug war was justified as necessary to stop violence. But the drug war created the violence. Before prohibition, cannabis was just agriculture. Farmers grew it. It was sold. Nobody was getting beheaded over hemp. After prohibition, that market became worth billions with zero legal suppliers, so criminal organizations filled the gap and used violence to protect market share. The same pattern played out globally. Colombia became synonymous with drug violence. Afghanistan's opium production funded the Taliban. Myanmar's drug trade funded armed insurgencies. The Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia became a war zone. West Africa became a transit point, bringing violence with it. Everywhere prohibition went, violence followed. Not because drugs cause violence, but because prohibition does. And America had the audacity to blame the producing countries for violence that American drug policy created. Mexico has a drug problem, American politicians would say, ignoring that American demand and American prohibition created the conditions for cartels to exist. America funded a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry through prohibition, then blamed other countries when that industry used violence. It's like setting someone's house on fire and then complaining about the smoke. The cost of all this enforcement was staggering. America alone spent over $50 billion per year on the drug war by the 2000s. $50 billion every year. Federal, state, and local governments combined spending on enforcement, prosecution, and incarceration. Over the decades, the total cost exceeded $1 trillion. $1 trillion fighting cannabis and other drugs. $1 trillion that could have been spent on education, on healthcare, on infrastructure, on literally anything else. Instead, it was spent arresting people, prosecuting them, and imprisoning them for possessing plants. And what did that $1 trillion accomplish? Usage rates remained stable or increased. Availability remained high. Every metric of drug war success showed failure. Studies consistently showed that marijuana use rates didn't correlate with how harshly it was enforced. States with harsh penalties didn't have lower usage rates than states with lenient penalties. Countries with death penalties didn't have lower usage than countries with decriminalization. The severity of punishment had no measurable impact on consumption. People use cannabis regardless of the legal consequences, because prohibition doesn't eliminate demand, it just criminalizes it. Portugal figured this out in 2001. Facing a serious drug problem, not cannabis specifically, but heroin and other drugs, Portugal took a radical approach. They decriminalized personal possession of all drugs, not just cannabis. All drugs. Possession became an administrative offence, not a criminal one. Get caught with drugs and you'd be sent to a counselling panel, not prison. Prohibitionists predicted disaster. They said usage would skyrocket. They said Portugal would become a drug tourism destination. They said the policy would fail spectacularly, and Portugal would have to recriminalise everything within a few years. They were wrong, comprehensively, totally wrong. Here's what actually happened in Portugal after decriminalisation. Drug use didn't increase significantly. In some age groups, it actually decreased. HIV infections from drug use plummeted because people could access clean needles without fear of arrest. Overdose deaths decreased because people could seek medical help without legal consequences. Drug-related crime decreased because petty possession was no longer a crime. The burden on the criminal justice system decreased dramatically, freeing up resources for serious crimes. Portugal spent the money they saved on enforcement on treatment and education instead. Turns out treating drug use as a health issue instead of a crime works better than arresting people. Revolutionary concept. Portugal proved that everything the drug warriors claimed about prohibition being necessary was wrong. You could decriminalise drugs, and society wouldn't collapse. In fact, society improved on virtually every metric, and the world mostly ignored it. Because admitting Portugal was right meant admitting the drug war was wrong, and governments don't like admitting they've wasted trillions of dollars and millions of lives on failed policy. Easier to just keep doing the same thing and hope nobody notices it's not working. But while governments were busy arresting people and funding cartels through prohibition, something else was happening. Medical patients were discovering that cannabis actually helped them, despite the government insisting it had no medical value, and sick people are harder to demonise than criminals. In the 1980s and 90s, the AIDS crisis was killing tens of thousands of people. AIDS patients suffered from wasting syndrome. They couldn't keep weight on, they were wasting away. The medications available, like AZT, had brutal side effects including severe nausea. Patients were dying, and the medications meant to help them made them so sick they couldn't eat. Some patients discovered that cannabis helped. It stimulated appetite. It reduced nausea. It allowed them to eat and maintain weight, which was literally the difference between dying faster and surviving longer. These weren't recreational users looking for an excuse. These were dying people who found something that helped. The government's response: arrest them. DEA agents raided buyers clubs and compassion clubs that provided cannabis to AIDS patients. They arrested sick people. They arrested the people helping sick people. Armed federal agents storming medical facilities to confiscate plants from dying patients. protecting and serving apparently, though it was unclear who exactly was being protected or served. Dennis Perron watched his partner die of AIDS. He saw how cannabis helped with the symptoms and the medication side effects. After his partner died, Perron opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club in 1992, providing cannabis to AIDS patients who needed it. It operated openly, serving thousands of patients, and the federal government responded by raiding it multiple times, because dying people accessing medicine was apparently a threat to public safety. Cancer patients were going through similar experiences. Chemotherapy is brutal. It kills cancer cells, but it also makes you violently ill. The nausea is so severe that many patients can't eat, can't keep food down, can't maintain strength to continue treatment. Some patients found that cannabis helped with the nausea. It allowed them to eat. It allowed them to continue treatment that might save their lives. And their government told them they were criminals. Doctors couldn't prescribe it because it was Schedule 1. No accepted medical use, remember? Patients had to choose between following the law and treating their symptoms. Between being a good citizen, not vomiting constantly. Many chose their health over the law because prohibition is less scary than dying, but it meant living as criminals while fighting cancer. Parents of children with epilepsy had perhaps the most heart-wrenching experiences. Some children have severe epilepsy that doesn't respond to traditional medications. They have hundreds of seizures per month. Hundreds. Imagine watching your child seize multiple times every single day, and nothing the doctors prescribe helps. Some parents discovered CBD, a non-intoxicating compound in cannabis. Unlike THC, CBD doesn't get you high. It doesn't impair you. It's not recreational, but it's still cannabis, which means it was still Schedule 1, which means it was still illegal, which means parents treating their seizing children were technically criminals. The most famous case was Charlotte Figge, a child with Dravet syndrome who was having over 300 seizures per month. 300. Her parents tried every medication available. Nothing worked. In desperation, they tried CBD oil. Charlotte's seizures dropped from 300 per month to just 2 or 3. From constant life-threatening seizures to nearly normal life. The CBD strain that helped her became known as Charlotte's Web. You'd think the government would respond to a child going from 300 seizures per month to 2 with, maybe this has medical value. Instead, the response was still illegal, still Schedule 1, still no accepted medical use. A child's seizures stopping wasn't evidence of medical value, apparently. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that position is genuinely impressive. Veterans were another group finding help from cannabis, particularly for PTSD. Veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with severe PTSD found that cannabis helped with nightmares, anxiety, hypervigilance. It allowed them to sleep. It reduced symptoms that made daily life unbearable. These were people who'd served their country, who'd been sent to war, who came back broken, and who found something that helped. And the VA wouldn't prescribe it. Federal policy prohibited VA doctors from prescribing or even recommending cannabis. Veterans who used it couldn't mention it to their VA doctors without risking their care. So veterans fought for their country, came back with service-related PTSD, found medicine that helped, and had to hide it from the very healthcare system meant to treat them. Support the troops, just not enough to let them access medicine. Thousands of patients with chronic pain found cannabis more effective than opioids, and with far fewer side effects. Opioids are physically addictive, cause severe constipation, depress breathing, and kill tens of thousands of Americans every year through overdose. Cannabis is not physically addictive, has mild side effects, and has never killed anyone through overdose because it's pharmacologically impossible. But cannabis was Schedule 1, high potential for abuse, no medical value. Opioids were Schedule 2, accepted medical use despite being literally deadly. The scheduling made no scientific sense. It made political sense, because the drug war was never about science. By the 2000s, the contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. The government insisted cannabis had no medical value, while thousands of patients were experiencing medical benefits. The government insisted cannabis was highly dangerous, while alcohol and tobacco, which actually kill people, remained legal. The government insisted prohibition was working while spending billions and accomplishing nothing except mass incarceration. Studies were finally being allowed, despite Schedule I restrictions making research difficult. Scientists needed DEA permission to study Schedule I substances, and the DEA wasn't eager to approve research that might undermine prohibition. But some research happened anyway, and the findings were consistently confirming what 5,000 years of human use already suggested. Cannabis was relatively safe and had medical applications. Research showed cannabis was effective for chronic pain, for nausea, for epilepsy, for multiple sclerosis symptoms, for PTSD, for anxiety, for insomnia, for inflammation. The list kept growing. Not a panacea, no drug is, but a legitimate medicine with real applications and relatively mild side effects compared to many alternatives. The endocannabinoid system research was expanding rapidly. Scientists discovered that this system regulates pain, mood, appetite, memory, immune function, and more. That humans have built-in receptors for cannabis compounds. That our bodies produce their own cannabinoids naturally. That cannabis works with our biology in ways that suggest we co-evolved with it over millennia. This discovery happened in 1992, after over 50 years of the government insisting cannabis had no medical value, after millions of arrests, after billions spent on enforcement, after countless lives destroyed. Scientists discovered that humans are literally designed to interact with cannabis, that we have biological systems specifically for processing cannabinoids, and the government just kept right on insisting it had no medical value. The research showed cannabis couldn't kill you through overdose. The lethal dose is so absurdly high that it's physically impossible to consume enough to die. You'd need to consume about 1,500 pounds in 15 minutes. You'd die from being crushed by the pile of cannabis, not from cannabis toxicity. Compare that to alcohol, which kills about 95,000 Americans per year, or tobacco, which kills about 480,000 Americans per year, or opioid pain medications, which kill tens of thousands per year. Cannabis deaths per year from overdose, 0. Throughout all of human history, 0. But alcohol and tobacco were legal, while cannabis was Schedule I. The scheduling system had no relationship to actual harm. The gateway drug theory was definitively debunked. Most cannabis users never progressed to harder drugs. The correlation between cannabis use and harder drug use was always spurious. Most heroin users drank milk before using heroin. That doesn't make milk a gateway drug. Correlation isn't causation, but that didn't stop prohibitionists from claiming otherwise for decades. The brain damage claims were revealed as fraudulent. The famous study claiming cannabis killed brain cells was debunked. That study had suffocated monkeys with cannabis smoke. Turns out suffocation damages brains, not cannabis. Actual research showed cannabis might be neuroprotective, potentially protecting brain cells rather than damaging them. Every major claim from the Prohibition era was wrong, not exaggerated, not slightly off. Completely, demonstrably, scientifically wrong. And yet Prohibition continued. Because the drug war was never about science or safety. It was about control, about arrests, about maintaining the massive enforcement infrastructure that had been built over decades, about justifying budgets and careers and political platforms. By the early 2000s, public opinion was shifting. More Americans had tried cannabis and realized the government had lied to them. More Americans knew someone who'd been arrested for cannabis and thought the punishment was ridiculous. More Americans were questioning why alcohol was legal while cannabis wasn't. The official narrative was crumbling under the weight of reality. Some countries were quietly moving away from harsh enforcement. The Netherlands had been tolerating cannabis sales since the 1970s. Spain developed a system of cannabis clubs operating in legal grey areas. Czech Republic decriminalised possession. Switzerland implemented harm reduction approaches that prioritised health over punishment. These countries weren't collapsing into drug-fuelled chaos. They were fine, better than fine, by most metrics. But most countries were still enforcing prohibition, still arresting people, still imprisoning them, still ruining lives over a plant. The machinery of the drug war had momentum. Bureaucracies had been built. Careers depended on it. Private prisons profited from it. Police budgets justified by it. Politicians campaigned on being tough on drugs. The incentives all pointed toward continuing prohibition regardless of evidence. And so the war continued. More arrests, more imprisonment, more lives destroyed, more money wasted, more violence created by prohibition, more patients denied medicine, more families separated, all for cannabis, a plant that had coexisted peacefully with humanity for 5,000 years until one bureaucrat needed a crisis to justify his job. The catastrophe Anslinger started had grown into a global disaster, and it showed no signs of stopping, until some people decided they'd had enough and started fighting back. The rebellion started with dying people, which in retrospect makes sense. When you're dying, you stop caring about laws that don't make sense. When cannabis is the difference between eating and wasting away, between managing pain and suffering, between seizures and stability, you stop worrying about what the DEA thinks. Dying people are remarkably difficult to intimidate. In the early 1990s, AIDS patients in San Francisco were organising, not to protest, not to march, just to survive. Dennis Perron's Cannabis Buyers Club was serving thousands of patients by the mid-90s. It operated openly, practically daring the feds to shut it down, and the feds obliged, raiding it multiple times. But every time they raided it, more people learned that the government was literally arresting dying people for accessing medicine. Optics matter, and armed agents confiscating plants from AIDS patients was not a good look. The raids backfired spectacularly. Instead of scaring people away, they generated sympathy and outrage. News coverage showed sick people being denied medicine by their own government. The public started asking uncomfortable questions like, why are we arresting cancer patients? And maybe the government is wrong about this. Revolutionary concepts. Cancer patients joined the chorus. Parents of epileptic children became advocates, and parents advocating for sick children are a political force nobody wants to oppose. Veterans with PTSD spoke out about cannabis helping where VA-prescribed medications failed. These weren't stereotypical stoners looking for an excuse to party. These were sympathetic patients with legitimate medical needs, and the government's response of suffer legally or feel better illegally was increasingly indefensible. By the mid-90s, the momentum for medical cannabis was building, and in 1996, California decided to do something radical. They held a vote. Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, asked California voters whether seriously ill patients should be allowed to use cannabis with a doctor's recommendation. This was direct democracy, challenging federal prohibition. The federal government was not pleased. The Clinton administration opposed Prop 215. The DEA opposed it. Every federal drug enforcement agency lined up to tell California voters that medical cannabis was dangerous, unnecessary, and would lead to disaster. California voters, in a stunning display of not caring what the federal government thought, passed Prop 215 with 56% of the vote. California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis. This was a direct middle finger to federal prohibition. The federal government said cannabis had no medical value. California said, "We disagree and we're allowing it anyway." The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution says federal law overrides state law, but California essentially said, "Sure, but you enforce it then." And the federal government tried. DEA raids on California dispensaries continued throughout the late 90s and 2000s. Federal agents would raid medical cannabis operations, arrest people operating legally under state law, and prosecute them in federal court where state law didn't matter. It was legal in California but still federally illegal, creating a bizarre legal limbo where you could be a law-abiding citizen under state law and a federal criminal simultaneously. Schrodinger's drug dealer, but the dam had cracked. Other states were watching. If California didn't immediately descend into chaos, and it didn't, then maybe the federal government was wrong. Maybe medical cannabis was fine. Maybe prohibition was the problem, not the plant. Alaska legalized medical cannabis in 1998, Oregon in 1998, Washington in 1998, Maine in 1999. The dominoes were falling. Slowly at first, then accelerating. Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, Montana. By the early 2000s, multiple states had medical cannabis programs. The federal government insisted this was illegal and dangerous, while states kept doing it anyway and not experiencing the predicted catastrophes. While states were rebelling and patients were organizing, scientists were finally getting permission to research cannabis more thoroughly. The findings were consistently undermining prohibition. Research showed cannabis was effective for chronic pain, allowing many patients to reduce or eliminate opioid use. Given that opioids were killing tens of thousands of Americans per year, this was significant. Cannabis as an opioid alternative could save lives. Studies on epilepsy confirmed what parents had been saying. CBD dramatically reduced seizures in some patients who didn't respond to traditional medications. Research on PTSD showed cannabis reduced symptoms. Studies on multiple sclerosis showed improvement in spasticity and pain. Research on nausea confirmed cannabis was effective for chemotherapy side effects. The evidence kept accumulating. The safety profile was confirmed by research. You can't overdose on cannabis. It's not physically addictive like opioids, alcohol, or nicotine. The side effects are relatively mild: hunger, dry mouth, sleepiness, potential short-term memory impairment while intoxicated. Compare that to common medications. Aspirin causes stomach bleeding. Tylenol causes liver damage. Prescription opioids cause respiratory depression and death. Cannabis causes the munchies and possibly falling asleep watching television. The gateway drug theory was dead. Thoroughly, completely debunked by multiple studies. Most cannabis users never use harder drugs. The correlation between cannabis and harder drugs was always spurious, like the correlation between ice cream consumption and drowning deaths. Both increase in summer, but ice cream doesn't cause drowning. Cannabis doesn't cause heroin use. Prohibition and lack of access to legal cannabis sometimes pushed people toward illegal markets where harder drugs were available, but that's a prohibition problem, not a cannabis problem. Israel was leading cannabis research because Israeli scientists could actually access cannabis for studies without fighting the DEA for permission. Dr. Raphael McCollum, who discovered THC in 1964 and later helped discover the endocannabinoid system, continued researching cannabis for decades. Israeli research was showing medical applications while American researchers were still fighting for DEA approval to study a Schedule I substance. The endocannabinoid system research was revealing how integral this system is to human health. It regulates pain, inflammation, immune response, mood, memory, appetite, sleep. It's one of the most important regulatory systems in the human body, and it's specifically designed to interact with cannabinoids. Humans aren't just compatible with cannabis, we're biologically designed for it. Evolution gave us cannabis receptors. The medical implications were profound. The political implications were ignored. Every piece of new research confirmed what ancient civilizations already knew. Cannabis is relatively safe and medically useful. 5,000 years of human experience now backed by modern science. And yet cannabis remained Schedule 1 federally. No accepted medical use, high potential for abuse. The government's position was increasingly ridiculous. But science alone doesn't change policy. Economics does. And by the 2000s, people were doing the math on prohibition versus legalization. The drug war was costing $50 billion per year. Enforcement, prosecution, incarceration. Billions spent arresting people, billions more imprisoning them. And what was it accomplishing? Usage rates unchanged. Availability high. Every metric of success showing failure. Meanwhile, cannabis prohibition was preventing tax revenue. If cannabis were legal and taxed like alcohol or tobacco, states could generate significant revenue. Colorado and Washington started calculating projections, sales taxes, excise taxes, licensing fees. Legal cannabis could generate hundreds of millions in annual revenue per state, potentially billions nationally. The tourism potential was obvious. Amsterdam had been demonstrating for decades that cannabis tourism was lucrative. People would travel internationally to legally access cannabis. If American states legalized, they could capture that tourism revenue domestically. Hotels, restaurants, transportation, entertainment, all benefiting from cannabis tourism. Job creation was another economic argument. Legal cannabis means legal businesses, which means jobs, cultivation, processing, testing, retail, security, transportation, marketing, accounting, legal services. Thousands of jobs per state, tens of thousands nationally. Legal businesses paying taxes, following regulations, contributing to the economy instead of enriching cartels. The black market versus regulated market argument was compelling. Illegal cannabis has no quality control, no safety testing, no age restrictions, no licensing requirements. Anyone can sell it, including to children. Legal cannabis requires testing for contaminants, potency labeling, child-resistant packaging, licensed sellers who check ID. Regulation makes cannabis safer and keeps it away from minors more effectively than prohibition ever did. And perhaps most compellingly, legal cannabis decimates cartel revenue. Mexican cartels made billions annually from cannabis. Legalization in US states immediately reduced that revenue. Turns out people prefer buying legal, tested products from licensed stores over buying illegal products from criminal organizations. When given the choice between legal and illegal, most people choose legal. Revolutionary. Governments were slowly realizing prohibition cost billions and accomplished nothing, while legalization generated revenue and reduced crime. The economics were undeniable. Prohibition was expensive failure. Legalization was profitable success. And governments love profit, even if it means admitting they were wrong for 80 years. In 2013, Uruguay did something unprecedented. They legalized cannabis nationally. Not medical cannabis, recreational cannabis. Full legalization, the entire country. President Jose Mujica, a former guerrilla fighter who had been imprisoned for years and emerged as a humble, philosophically minded president who drove a Volkswagen Beetle, looked at drug prohibition and decided it was stupid. Mujica's argument was straightforward. Prohibition doesn't work, creates violence, enriches criminals, and violates personal freedom. Legalization removes the criminal market, generates tax revenue, and treats adults like adults capable of making their own decisions. The Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones, he said, implying that drug policy shouldn't continue just because it's always been done that way. Progress requires trying something different. Uruguay implemented a government-controlled model. Cannabis cultivation and sales were regulated by the state. Citizens could grow their own, join cannabis clubs, or purchase from licensed pharmacies. Prices were kept low to undercut the black market. Quality was controlled, age restrictions enforced. Prohibitionists predicted disaster. They said usage would skyrocket. They said Uruguay would become a drug tourism destination. They said organised crime would increase, not decrease. They said society would collapse. They were wrong. Usage didn't spike significantly. Some increases in certain demographics, some decreases in others. Overall relatively stable. Uruguay didn't become a drug tourism destination. They specifically designed the system to prevent that. Organised crime's cannabis revenue decreased because legal cannabis was cheaper and higher quality. Society did not collapse. Uruguay remained Uruguay, just with legal cannabis and without cannabis-related arrests. Uruguay proved that full legalization could work. The entire country legalized cannabis and the sky didn't fall. This should have ended the debate globally. One nation demonstrated conclusively that legalization doesn't cause the problems prohibitionists predicted. But most countries ignored Uruguay's success because admitting Uruguay was right meant admitting prohibition was wrong. Meanwhile, back in the United States, two states were about to take an even bigger step. In 2012, Colorado and Washington both held votes on recreational cannabis legalization. Not medical, recreational. Full legalization for adults. Both states passed their measures. Colorado's Amendment 64 passed with 55%. Washington's Initiative 502 passed with 56%. The federal government, now under Obama, faced a choice: enforce federal prohibition against states, or let states experiment. Attorney General Eric Holder announced the DOJ wouldn't interfere with state legalization as long as states implemented robust regulatory systems. This was pragmatic surrender. The federal government couldn't stop states from legalizing, and trying would be politically unpopular and practically impossible, so they just didn't. Federal prohibition remained on the books, but enforcement against state legal operations mostly stopped. January 1st, 2014, Colorado opened the first legal recreational cannabis stores in the United States since Prohibition began. The media descended on Denver expecting chaos. News cameras captured lines of people waiting to legally purchase cannabis, not riots or violence, just orderly commerce. The first day generated over $1 million in sales. The first year generated over $700 million. Tax revenue exceeded projections. Everything prohibitionists predicted would happen didn't happen. Teen use didn't spike, it actually decreased slightly. Possibly because legal regulation made it harder for teens to access than black market dealers who don't check ID. DUI rates didn't increase significantly. Crime didn't increase. Workplace accidents didn't increase. Emergency room visits didn't spike. Traffic fatalities didn't increase. Every scare tactic used to oppose legalization failed to materialize. What did happen? Colorado generated hundreds of millions in tax revenue. That money funded schools, infrastructure, drug treatment programs. Thousands of jobs were created. Tourism increased. Real estate values in Denver rose. The economy benefited. And perhaps most importantly, people stopped being arrested for cannabis. Arrests plummeted. People weren't getting criminal records for possession. Families weren't being separated, lives weren't being destroyed. Washington saw similar results: tax revenue, job creation, decreased arrests, no social catastrophe. Other states were watching closely. If Colorado and Washington didn't implode, maybe legalization was safe. Oregon legalized in 2014, Alaska in 2014, Washington, D.C. in 2014. The dominoes were falling faster. California, Nevada, Massachusetts and Maine in 2016, Michigan in 2018, Illinois in 2019, New Jersey, Arizona, Montana and South Dakota in 2020. By 2024, 24 states had legalized recreational cannabis, nearly half the country, representing half the population. The American experiment with re-legalization was working. States with legal cannabis weren't experiencing disasters. They were generating revenue, creating jobs, and not arresting people for plants. Meanwhile, states that maintained prohibition were spending money on enforcement while watching tax revenue go to neighbouring legal states. The economic incentive to legalize was undeniable. But America wasn't alone in reversing prohibition. Globally, the dominoes were falling. Canada legalized nationally in 2018 under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Canada became the first G7 nation to legalize recreational cannabis. The entire country, coast to coast. Legal cannabis for all adults. America's polite northern neighbour did what America claimed would destroy civilization, and Canada remained disappointingly civilized. Politeness levels unchanged. Mexico's Supreme Court ruled prohibition unconstitutional in 2018. Multiple rulings confirmed adults have a right to cannabis. The government dragged its feet on implementation, but the legal framework for legalization was established. Mexico, tired of cartel violence that American prohibition helped create, was moving toward legalization. In Europe, the dominoes were falling slower but still falling. Luxembourg legalized cultivation for personal use. Malta legalized possession and home cultivation. Germany announced plans for legalization and began implementation in 2024. Spain's Cannabis Club model continued operating in legal grey areas. Portugal's 2001 decriminalisation continued showing positive results, demonstrating that treating drug use as a health issue instead of a crime works better than prohibition. Thailand shocked everyone in 2022 by becoming the first Asian country to decriminalise cannabis. Thailand went from harsh penalties to decriminalisation practically overnight. The same country that had criminalised cannabis under Western pressure was now decriminalising it before most Western countries. The reversal was stunning. Asia was supposed to be the region most resistant to cannabis reform. Thailand said, actually, no. In Africa, South Africa's Constitutional Court ruled prohibition violated constitutional rights in 2018. Adults could possess and cultivate cannabis privately. Lesotho licensed legal cannabis cultivation for export, becoming one of the first African countries to enter the legal cannabis market. Morocco, which had been producing hashish for centuries before criminalisation, began moving toward legalisation, recognising the economic potential of their traditional cannabis cultivation. The global prohibition consensus was crumbling. The 1961 Single Convention was effectively dead. Member nations were openly violating it, and the UN couldn't do anything. International drug control was based on treaties countries increasingly ignored. The enforcement mechanism was angry letters, and angry letters don't stop sovereign nations from legalizing. The UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs took a small step in 2020, removing cannabis from Schedule 4 of the Single Convention, acknowledging some medical value. This was 43 years after California legalized medical cannabis. The UN was not leading on drug policy reform. They were slowly, reluctantly following. By 2024, the global cannabis landscape was transformed. Large parts of North America legal, parts of Europe legal or decriminalized. Thailand leading Asia in reform, Uruguay blazing the trail in South America. Canada showing the G7 that legalization works. Meanwhile, Prohibition holdouts looked increasingly absurd, maintaining laws based on decades-old panic while evidence showed those laws were unnecessary. But here's where the story gets frustrating. Despite all this progress, despite legalization spreading, despite evidence that Prohibition was wrong, governments refused to apologize. Zero official apologies. Zero acknowledgement that maybe destroying millions of lives over a plant was a mistake. Zero reparations for people imprisoned, for families separated, for futures destroyed. People were still imprisoned for cannabis offences that were now legal in their states. Thousands serving sentences for growing plants that licensed businesses were now legally growing. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. You could be in prison for cannabis cultivation while the shop next to the prison legally sold cannabis. Justice system working as intended, apparently. Criminal records still haunted millions. Yes, some states implemented expungement programs, allowing people to clear cannabis convictions. But the process was slow, bureaucratic, and many people didn't know they were eligible. Millions still carried records for something that was no longer illegal. Those records still affected employment, housing, education, voting rights. The punishment continued long after the law changed. And here's the truly infuriating part. The legal cannabis industry was predominantly white and wealthy. Legal cannabis became a billion-dollar industry. Billions in annual sales. Thousands of businesses. And ownership was overwhelmingly white, male, and wealthy. The same communities devastated by cannabis prohibition were largely locked out of the legal industry. Why? Because starting a legal cannabis business required capital, licensing fees, real estate, inventory, security, legal compliance, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars to start. The people who had the capital were people who hadn't been arrested. The communities targeted by the drug war for decades didn't have that capital, because the drug war had systematically impoverished them through arrests and incarceration. Criminal records prevented participation. Many states required clean records for cannabis business licenses. The people with the most expertise, people who'd been growing and selling cannabis successfully for years, were excluded from the legal market because they had been arrested for doing exactly what was now legal. You needed $500,000 and a clean record. Guess who had that? Not the communities that suffered under Prohibition. Social equity programs were implemented in some states, attempting to prioritize licenses for people from communities disproportionately harmed by Prohibition. But these programs were underfunded, poorly designed, and often captured by connected people gaming the system. The intention was good. The implementation was inadequate. The result was a legal industry that profited from the very thing millions were imprisoned for, while those millions remained excluded. White entrepreneurs became millionaires selling cannabis. Black men remained in prison for cannabis. The same plant, the same activity. Different outcomes based on timing, race, and resources. If that's not systemic injustice, the term has no meaning. The medical cannabis revolution continued alongside recreational legalization. Research that was suppressed for decades was finally happening. Studies confirmed cannabis helped chronic pain, allowing opioid reduction. Research showed anti-inflammatory properties, neuroprotective effects, anti-nausea benefits, seizure reduction, PTSD symptom improvement, anxiety relief, sleep improvement. The medical applications kept expanding. Cannabis wasn't a cure-all, no drug is, but it was a legitimate medicine with real applications and relatively mild side effects. Everything ancient civilizations knew. now confirmed by modern science, now slowly being accepted by medical establishments that had rejected it for 80 years. The opioid crisis made cannabis legalization more urgent. Opioids were killing over 70,000 Americans per year by the late 2010s. Prescription opioids, mostly legal, mostly prescribed by doctors, were killing more Americans than car accidents. States with medical cannabis programs saw significant reductions in opioid prescriptions and opioid deaths. Cannabis as an opioid alternative could save thousands of lives annually. But cannabis remained Schedule I federally in the United States as of 2024, still officially classified as having no medical value, still in the same category as heroin, despite half the states legalizing it, despite millions of patients using it medically, despite decades of research confirming medical value. The federal government just kept insisting it had no medical value while states licensed medical cannabis programs, and the industry generated billions in sales. The DEA had the authority to reschedule cannabis. They could move it to Schedule II or lower, acknowledging medical value. They refused for decades, despite evidence, despite recommendations, despite pressure. The DEA, whose budget and authority depended on drug enforcement, declined to reduce restrictions on drugs, shocking absolutely no one who understood institutional incentives. The situation as of 2024 was absurd. Cannabis was legal in 24 states, medical in 38 states, but federally illegal. Legal businesses operated in violation of federal law. State legal cannabis companies couldn't use banks because federal banking regulations prohibited serving cannabis businesses. Dispensaries operated in cash, creating security risks and operational nightmares. Ridiculous. Scientists still needed DEA approval for cannabis research, making medical studies difficult despite growing state legal access. Veterans couldn't access cannabis through the VA, despite many states legalizing medical cannabis for PTSD. Federal employees and military members were prohibited from using cannabis, even in states where it was legal. The contradictions were everywhere. Interstate commerce in cannabis remained illegal. Colorado couldn't ship cannabis to California even though both states legalized it, because crossing state lines made it federal jurisdiction. The cannabis industry was trapped in a state-by-state patchwork, unable to operate nationally like normal businesses. So where does this leave us? After 5,000 years of peaceful human cannabis coexistence, after 100 years of prohibition built on racism and lies, after millions of arrests and billions of dollars wasted, after decades of evidence that prohibition doesn't work, we're in this weird transitional period where half the country has admitted prohibition was wrong, while the federal government pretends nothing has changed. The 5,000-year perspective is helpful here. For 98% of human history with cannabis, prohibition didn't exist. It was a 100-year aberration, a violent, expensive, racist aberration that destroyed millions of lives, but an aberration nonetheless. History's trend line is clear. Humans and cannabis coexist peacefully unless governments decide otherwise. Cannabis won by doing what plants do, existing. It just kept growing. Through prohibition, through propaganda, through raids and arrests and global treaties, cannabis kept growing. Because it's a weed. Weeds are really good at existing despite efforts to eliminate them. Humans kept using it because prohibition doesn't eliminate demand, it just criminalizes supply. The plant remained unchanged throughout. Same cannabis in 2000 BCE, same cannabis in 1930, same cannabis in 2024. Humans' reactions changed. The plant just was. The lessons, if anyone's learning them, prohibition doesn't work. It never worked. Every metric of success showed failure. Usage rates unchanged despite trillions spent and millions arrested. Prohibition enriches criminals, not societies. Every illegal market is a business opportunity for people comfortable with violence. Legalization is the most effective way to defund cartels. Racism can hide behind drug policy. If your drug law coincidentally targets minorities exclusively, it's not a drug law, it's racism law. The cannabis prohibition was never about cannabis. It was about control. Science eventually wins, but policy lags decades behind. We knew prohibition was wrong in the 1940s. We're implementing that knowledge in the 2020s. 80-year lag time between evidence and policy. Not great. Public opinion eventually forces change. Governments don't lead on drug policy reform. They follow reluctantly decades behind the public. Economic incentives matter more than moral arguments. Governments resisted legalization until they realized they could tax it instead of spending billions fighting it. Principle is expensive. Revenue is persuasive. 80 years of suppressed medical research, potential treatments delayed, patients who suffered without access, millions of lives destroyed by incarceration, families separated, communities destabilized, generational trauma, trust in government, international relations damaged by American drug war imperialism, the opportunity cost of prohibition, literally everything else those trillions of dollars could have funded. What we're slowly relearning, ancient cultures were right. Cannabis is relatively safe and medically useful. Treating adults like adults capable of making their own decisions works better than prohibition. Regulation works better than criminalization. Health approaches work better than punishment. A plant that humans used safely for 5,000 years was declared dangerous for 100 years, and now we're slowly admitting it was actually fine all along. The plant never changed. Humans just panicked, then spent a century doubling down on panic before finally, gradually, reluctantly backing away from the hysteria.